So I'm going to start us off with a reading and where we left off. So if Cassidy, if you want to go ahead and...
Not this one. I've got 17 through 23.
You've got 17 through 23. Who has chapter 2, verses 8 through 11? I gave that to somebody over in this general area. Esther chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. I think we did too. So, all right, if we did 8 through 11, does somebody have 12 through 14? You've got 12 through 14. All right. Okay, 12 through 16.
Each young woman's turn came to join the king Ahasuerus. Try this one. After she had completed the 12 months' preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus there were days of their preparation appointed, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the woman's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shahrazag, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, they had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requesting nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch and the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into the royal palace, into the 10th month, which is the 10th month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign.
All right. So we'll talk about Esther for just a minute. And the first thing I want to point out is when Esther is introduced to us, she's been taken to the king's palace, which I think we pointed out last week does not imply coercion. There were many young ladies. Josephus says there were 400. That could be an exaggeration. The authors had a tendency to sometimes exaggerate, but it may not have been. As we've seen, Xerxes had the money to throw a party for 6 months long for everybody that was in his royal officers. So these guys had a lot of wealth to throw around. Harems and concubines were pretty common. In fact, the kings of Israel were warned against this behavior. The passage I have up here in 1 Samuel talks about when Samuel is talking to the people of Israel and saying, the kings that you want is going to take your daughters and take them into his harem, essentially. But then the kings are also specifically warned against that behavior in the law. All right, so she quickly finds favor with those in charge. Now, one of the things that we want to point out here, let's see if this is it. Yep. All right. So she quickly finds favor with those in charge. And one of the things I want to ask about is what kind of inaction does that imply? So we remember that Daniel found favor as well. Is this a passive thing where everybody just likes the way she looks, everybody finds her pleasing? Or is this an active thing where her behavior and other things are actively gaining her favor with people? Go ahead, Trish.
Well, I kind of picture a buzz in the room. You know, it's not just shaking their heads. There's a lot going on, showing. That's probably the only proper way they could show their opinion, because they couldn't just speak up and say their opinion.
Okay. What do we know about when Daniel and his friends are taken into captivity? They're put in the care of the eunuchs. They're given this course of... so you'll find some similarities here. What happens to the young ladies that are brought into the harem at the start? What are they supposed to do? Prepare. Okay, they prepare, exactly. And we find that same kind of preparation with Daniel and his friends, right? They're given this course of particular things that they're supposed to eat, things that they're supposed to go through, and in doing so, they find favor in the sight of the people that they are working under. And how do they do that in the case of Daniel? Or they do it by just going along with everything they're told.
There's a great deal of respect that Daniel and the other men showed toward the eunuchs, to whoever they dealt with in the kingdom. They showed respect and of their authority. They showed respect when they did not agree with what they were being asked to do. They very respectfully explained what they wanted and needed to do.
All right, so I think that's a very important point. They were told to do something that they shouldn't necessarily do. And they very respectfully go through the process of attempting to get that changed. They set up a test, don't they? They say to the eunuch, hey, give us a shot at trying it this way, and if it doesn't work, we'll do it your way. But they give the people in authority the respect that they deserve, not necessarily because of who they are, but because of the position that they're in. In fact, we find that sort of behavior all throughout the book of Daniel when, I'll use their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are going to be thrown into the furnace. What's their response to Nebuchadnezzar, who says, fall down and worship my gods? How do they talk to the king?
Very respectfully.
Okay, very respectfully.
They call on the name of the Lord. He will, if it's so to be, he will take care of us.
That's right. And I always enjoy the very flowery phrasings that they use to talk to the people in authority, but they're not there to try to buck his authority in regards to his kingdom, but in regards to the religious restrictions that he's attempting to place on them. They have something to say about that. All right, so Esther probably is in a similar position where she is finding favor with people, perhaps along with, what are some of the things that she does in terms of what we see here for the preparations? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, for one, she listens. It says that when she went into the king, she only took those things that were recommended. So, that gives us the idea that, she's listening to the wisdom that they have and trying to be, obedient to that.
Yeah, and I like the fact that she specifically asks the eunuchs who are in charge what to take in. There's a pretty good lesson maybe for that for us in there, in that she doesn't go and ask the other people in the harem. She doesn't go and ask some other people. She goes to the people who are going to know best what is successful in these regards, and they give her advice, and then she follows through on it. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, just along those lines, I think that in a mentor-driven kind of program, there's nothing more frustrating and challenging and will get mentees kicked out faster than God's gift to blank, whatever it is. So if you have, in this case, we might imply that maybe there were some ladies that knew they were God's gift to beauty, and they had everything figured out. That might be a very different kind of mindset than Esther, who comes in going, this is someone else's world. They went through this beautification process that was specific to the Persians, not necessarily the Jews. So, what do I need to do? And I think that we can imply an awful lot about Esther just from those statements right there, that she allowed herself to be mentored, and there's a possibility that others did not.
So take note, those of you who are not yet in the job market, what Aaron is saying. When it comes time to go find a job, and it comes time to learn under somebody what you're supposed to be doing, listen to the people who are telling you how to do things. Listen to people who are telling you what they're doing, because that kind of mentor-mentee relationship is a great way to pick up a lot of skills very quickly. I have mentored people, and I can tell you that there is a vast difference between people who think they know exactly what they're doing all the time and people who don't. And people who are willing to learn. And even for me, I have to be willing to learn new things. I have to be willing to look to somebody who is in a position and says, hey, we need to do something a little different. All right, so how is it that Mordecai, who is known to be a Jew, but the palace seems ignorant of Esther being Jewish? How does that work?
What do you mean?
Well, everybody knows that Mordecai is a Jew, apparently. Why does nobody know that Esther is a Jew? Okay, he told her not to reveal it, so she has clearly kept to what he said. All right, so here is I like this slide. This is a plan of the royal palace at Susa with the area of the harem. You can see where the throne hall is, where the court is, the inner court, the middle court, and there are various areas that they think were probably the court of the harem here, over here, and over here. And you'll notice that there's two different areas of it, right? There's the area that is under, and there's two different guys. Let's see, we have, I have to put my reading glasses on here. All right. So that you first have the first eunuch who, let's see, Shashgaz is the second one, and then the first one is, where is he? Who was it? Haggai? Yes. Yeah. So you have Haggai and Shashgaz. And you notice there's two different areas of authority. One of them is before they go into the king, and the other one is after they have gone into the king. So Esther is preparing, and you have this 12 months of preparation. 6 months with, Yeah, we just read that. All right, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices. Do you think this is actual time, or is this hyperbole? It could be actual time, absolutely. So it could be a year-long process that they're going through. And interestingly enough, this also reflects the length of the banquet, which was 6 months long. So you have 6 months of this preparation with this thing and 6 months of the preparation with the other. Myrrh is a natural resin. It's used throughout history as a perfume, incense, and medicine. And really, what does this process emphasize? If you've got a year's worth of preparation with expensive oils and spices and other things like that, it's wealth. It's just another way of Xerxes showing off, isn't it? He can afford to put, if there were 400 women through this process, all with these different expensive perfumes and oils and spices. And you have to remember, this is the ancient world where spices are not as readily available as they are now. I can go buy salt and pepper at H-E-B and they're cheap, or inexpensive, relatively speaking. But Roman officers were paid in salt. It was valuable back in the ancient world, and if it's valuable, that means it's scarce. So Xerxes has access to scarce resources that he can just lavish on people. And again, it goes back to all the wealth that he has. All right, so 4 years after Vashti's removal, Esther goes into the king. And so this is in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign to the 7th year. So that's 482 to 478 BC. And Esther relies on the advice of someone who knows the king, as we talked about. And as we noted, there's 2 harems, and there's that change of overnight status between Haggai and Shashgaz. All right, so next I have Esther chapter 2, and then starting in verse 17. Is that you, Cassidy? All right, go ahead.
The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate,
Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king.
All right, so the first question here is, did the selection of Esther follow immediately? What's that? No. Okay. So what happens first? Okay, so they went through the beatification process. Esther goes into the king, and after Esther has gone into the king, what happens? Okay, she finds great favor with him, and then what happens right after that? Okay, she's named queen, and Xerxes, okay, we got another banquet. We're going to throw a party. Again. So, and this one was for the princes and servants. It includes a holiday and gifts. This is a relief of Ashurbanipal and his wife in a garden from Nineveh in the 7th century BC. And this is, again, you'll remember we talked about a couple of weeks ago that it was rare for women to be depicted in the art of these people. So this is, again, one of those rare carvings of somebody depicting a woman, and here's with Ashurbanipal of Assyria. So next we have Mordecai thwarting a plot.
Hey, Aaron.
There we go. Yes, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. A question here in verse 20. Let's see here. Yeah, verse 22. When Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. When the report was investigated, they were hanged.
Yep.
It seems very casual here that, Esther learned this plot from Mordecai, and she said, okay, well, I'll go tell the king. But part of the story of saving the Jews is that, am I getting this wrong? Am I misremembering this? It was a big deal for her to go into she risked her life to go in and tell him. But here it just seems like, hey, king, I heard something today. You may want to check into it.
So I suspect what we're seeing here is over time, a difference in access to the king. If Esther is being called into the king, especially at this time, after she has just been made queen, she probably has more access to the king. We're also not told if there is any kind of intermediary here. Is there a possibility that she went and told Shashgaz? Is there a possibility that she went through some other official or intermediary to get the ear of the king? We don't know exactly. All we're told is that she got word to the king somehow in Mordecai's name. So I don't think it's necessarily inconsistent so much as what we're seeing is a difference in what happens right after she's been named queen versus a little bit later when perhaps she's not seeing the king as often or on as regular a basis. We do know that what the problem there was that she hadn't been called by the king. Very likely she is being called by the king on a semi-regular basis early on here, especially during this banquet when it's in her honor. She's going to see the king. That's speculative, of course. I can't say that for certain, but that seems logical at least.
I was also going to add that perhaps the seriousness of the situation prompted her to take more drastic actions than what would have been earlier.
Yeah, I think the king is probably more likely to be lenient towards something that reveals a direct threat against his person. That's a good point.
Aaron, I'm backing up a step. I have a question. When you were talking about Esther, I understand the being respectful and gaining favor and all that. But when we're comparing to Daniel's friends, Daniel and his friends did not do anything, again, when it came to the fiery furnace, they said, no, we're being respectful, but no, we're not bowing down to you. Now, here we have a Jewish virgin who's giving herself to a pagan, uncircumcised king. Wouldn't an analogy be that she would have said respectfully, this is against, my God and our laws? And
That's a good question, and I don't know.
I mean, I get the whole big story that God ends up using it for good, but I don't know. I don't love this story that I feel like it's unlike Joseph, who said, no, I can't sleep with the Pharaoh's wife. I mean,
Right.
that where they stand up for their values. Here, I feel like it's all okay, and God uses it for good for sure, because God can do that always, but I don't know.
We're not really given any information on it one way or the other. And we can look at other kings like Solomon, for example, who was influenced by his foreign wives to his detriment. And that is roundly condemned in the scriptures. And in fact, it talks about how that's why the kingdom was split in the first place. We also have Ezra and Nehemiah, in which the people of Israel are repeatedly, I don't want to say browbeaten, but Nehemiah does go and he pulls their hair and beards for taking foreign wives from other nations and for having children that don't speak Hebrew and other things like that. There is definitely a sense in which that kind of behavior is not what God wants. However, we also have the example of somebody like Samson, for whom it says that, he insisted on taking a Philistine wife, and it was not ideal, but it was that was part of God's plan for what Samson was going to do to avenge the Israelites on the Philistines. The only answer I can give you is out of Esther chapter 4, which is when we have the famous, who knows if you have been raised to this for such a time as this. That's the best answer I can give you, unfortunately. That, and saying that in the past, that is how God has viewed things, is that when there are less than ideal circumstances, that the Lord chooses to use them anyway. Perhaps a good example would be where we have Ruth the Moabitess, who becomes in the lineage of Christ as a result of her obedience and her willingness to follow Naomi into the land of Israel. Here, Esther is obeying Mordecai, who has raised her, and she is in subjection to him, and she follows his advice to become eventually queen. More than that, I cannot say. I hope that's a reasonable answer, if not a complete one. Go ahead. All right, I've got Kyle and then Larry.
Well, let's remember that God is a God of deliverance, and he used nations and obviously must have used peoples of those nations to discipline the Jews and to preserve the Jews. He calls Assyria the rod of my anger, which came against the 10 tribes and took them away. So it's still all about that, and there were people that obviously were ministers or other people that influenced all along the way. I think it's likely to presume that, given how God was preserving his people.
All right, go ahead, Larry.
Well, I was just going to comment that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, and then I'll get Aaron.
In the case of the Jewish men, God did not want them influenced by foreign women, where here you have a Jewish woman that could have some influence on a foreign man.
That's an interesting
Just
observation.
speculation.
Go ahead, Aaron.
So I was going to go along kind of with that comment, comparing and contrasting Esther and Daniel. So I think one take we could also have, because I totally get that, is that we have an opportunity to maybe see a growth story. So right here at the beginning, she's just kind of saying yes to everything, which is valuable. We've just talked about how in a business setting, it's nice to have someone who can recognize experience and recognize they don't know everything and listen to that. At the end of the story, now she's asking everyone else to fast. So I think we can also kind of realize that God gives us an opportunity to grow like spiritual children. So maybe in a intellectual sense, and she's following Mordecai, she's submitting to what everyone says, but maybe she grows spiritually throughout the story, such that at the end, when there's something that requires great courage, she says, "Everyone, please fast for me," and she develops a spiritual plan and strategy to go forward. And so we might be able to look at this as just also a spiritual growth story, where she starts out saying yes to everything, and then later on becomes a much richer spiritual character. That's growth.
Yeah, I'm willing to buy into that, especially when we talk about, we mentioned Joseph in the course of that. Joseph starts out, and I've got to admit, I kind of think what at least as far as he's depicted, telling your 10 older brothers that they're going to bow down to you is kind of a bratty move. By the end of it, though, he's matured quite a bit. And gets his family to move down there and says he's going to take care of them and provide for them. He doesn't lord it over them other than playing a bit of a prank on them. But he's got some growth that he goes through while he's there in the land of Egypt. So perhaps we're seeing growth on the part of Esther as well. That's a great point. All right. Anything else before we move on? Okay, so we have these glazed brick reliefs of soldiers from Susa, and Mordecai is going to thwart a plot against the king. I like this because it shows how the armor that they wear, they're wielding a spear, they're carrying a bow, they've got this kind of mid-calf, baggy clothing, typical of the soldiers in the Persian Guard. Now, we get to this word, hanged. What does that mean? Because we're going to run into it a little bit later. And I'll tell you what, they didn't hang people like we do, or did, in the United States. It wasn't a noose. So you've got a gallows, and we're going to see the construction of that later. You've got what's referred to as a tree, which is probably just a long piece of timber. You can see in the image on, let's see, is this the right slide? Yeah. You can see on this image, what are they doing to these guys? Are they hanging them? They're impaling them. It was impaling. That was their version of hanging. Okay? The gallows wasn't a platform and crossbeam. The Hebrew word used here and elsewhere is literally a tree, although the word can refer to a pole or other wooden object. But the best evidence points to the tree as a form of impalement. So we have the following evidence that's relevant. The gallows, as we think of it, platform, crossbeam, rope around the neck, trapdoor, is a relatively modern invention. That wasn't known until around the 19th century, or before, 18th century. Impalement as a method of execution is well known from the Assyrian period, a couple of centuries before Xerxes, as evidenced in the art. The Greek historian Herodotus records that Darius impaled about 3,000 men of Babylon following a rebellion. And in the Behestan inscription that we talked about a couple weeks ago, Darius the Great, the father of Xerxes, describes 4 different men, along with an unknown number of their followers, whom he had impaled because of their treachery. So here we see treason. Impalement is a punishment for treason. And then Ezra chapter 6 and verse 11 records a threat of Darius II against anyone who might interfere with the continued construction of the temple in Jerusalem. A timber shall be drawn from his house, and he shall be impaled on it. And this demonstrates the continuation of impalement after the time of Esther even. All right, so several English versions have followed this understanding, so the CEB, NIV, and the NLT. And the bronze gate bands, let's see, we got them here. Oh yeah, there we go. Bronze gate bands here were photographed at the British Museum and depict 2 cases of impalement. All right, so a chronicle. A chronicle was literally the events of the days. It was a logbook. The kings kept logs. The tablet shown here is in Akkadian and records the reign of the Babylonian king Nabonidus, the rise of the Persian king Cyrus the Great, and the demise of the Babylonian Empire, followed by the founding of the Persian Empire. Its place of origin is unknown, and this was in the British Museum. But they kept logs of what happened. And we found stone tablets that have all this writing on them that tells just about court events. It would be much like we have court reporters in not only courtrooms, but also in sessions of Congress and other things like that, where they're required to record everything that everybody says. I don't know if you've ever been in, how many of you have been done jury duty before, or at least sat for, yeah, so you're familiar with the process. You go in there, what do they tell you about the court reporter? You have to speak up so that the court reporter can hear you. Yeah, because she or he is responsible for taking down everything that's said in that room and logging it. So these guys had similar processes. All right, so moving into Esther chapter 3, where Haman plots against the Jews. Who has Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 7? All right, go ahead.
After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's commands?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar.
All right. So the first thing that we have in this verse is that Haman is promoted. What position is he promoted to? Yeah, he's basically promoted to second in command. You may recall similar promotions like that when Pharaoh says to Joseph, what? You'll be second only to me. Exactly. Or when Daniel is promoted, or when some of those other, important promotion happens. Essentially, the king is saying, you've got my voice and my trust in everything that you do. That's what Haman has got here. Did Haman have cause for his anger? Mordecai doesn't bow down to him or honor him. Does Mordecai have cause? It's pride, absolutely. And did Mordecai have precedent for not bowing down? Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's some family ancestry that comes into play here. Mordecai being from the family of Saul, and Haman being from the family of King Agag. So there was some bad blood between the two of them.
Yep. All right. Go ahead, Jim.
There's also, I'm going to read next too, so I thought it might be convenient to get the mic, but there's also in military bearing. I mean, there's this idea that a leader can't afford to allow anyone to be subordinate because of the example that would set. So it's an undermining of his authority. I do believe it's correct that it was probably mostly pride. However, that's also a big consideration in most, lines of authority, right?
There's an interesting thing there where so we're looking at some interplay here. And you're right. So there is that idea of chain of command and authority. We have some issues, though, don't we? Because what goes along with the chain of command in Persian authority? So Haman is second to Ahasuerus or Xerxes, and Xerxes believes he's second to
no one,
to their god.
Yeah, maybe their god.
Right? So if you're bowing down to Haman, who are you also bowing down to? You're also bowing down to their god. So go ahead and read Genesis 42 and 6, and then 1 Samuel 24 and 8.
Oh, I have Esther 3, 7 through 11.
You've got Esther 3. Who's got Genesis 42, 6? Oh, go ahead, Kurt.
Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground.
Okay. And then 1 Samuel 24 and verse 8.
Yes. Now afterward David arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and prostrated himself.
All right, so in those cases, who are they bowing to? Their king, all right. But also, who does Saul represent? Who does David constantly say that Saul represents? He says he represents God. So there's this understanding that in bowing down to Saul, it's not because he's necessarily bowing down to the king, but because who the king represents. So, and he was appointed by God. Can we infer that perhaps Mordecai refuses because he does not see himself as able to bow down before Haman, who represents a foreign god? How deep did this perceived insult run? What does Haman say? He makes an extension to all the Jews. Now, he didn't want to just arrest Mordecai for doing this. He's so angry that he's going to wipe out everybody that Mordecai is related to as well. That seems a little extreme, perhaps, to us, but as we're going to see in in Haman's argument to the king a little bit later, he has some reasons why he thinks that way. And we'll read in Ezra, there were some reasons why other people thought that way about the Jews as a people in general. First, I want to give you an aerial view of Persepolis. So, we have you can see the city, the area where the king's palace is, a lot of other ruins and things like that. This is not a small place. I like this one. This is a view of the entrance to the king's palace there. You can see the relief carving of the soldiers over here. And then we have the procession of Median and Persian dignitaries. The figure of a Persian dignitary is a relief on the north stairs of the Persepolis Apodana. A common view among commentators, both ancient and modern, is that the term Agagite refers to a descendant of the only Agag named in Scripture. So as we've noted, there is the possibility. This then provides a reason for Haman's hatred of the Jews, since Amalek was a descendant of Jacob's rival Esau. The Amalekites attacked the Israelites, and then Saul later attacked and destroyed the Amalekites. Samuel personally killed Agag. However, a remnant of Amalekites survived, and it is theorized that some of Agag's descendants escaped and fled to Persia. Here's a slide showing Elamites bowing down to Assyrians from the palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 7th century BC. It says, all the king's servants who were in the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. This is that same idea. Now that's the king's gate. That's the king's gate in Persepolis. We're in Susa, so similar kind of area. This is where Mordecai would have sat and conducted his business day after day. The gatehouse at Susa probably had elements similar to the gate of all lands here at Persepolis. All right, let's go ahead and read Esther chapter 3, verses 7 through 11.
In the first month, the month of Nisan, in the king's 12th year, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast before Haman for each day in each month, and it fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman informed the king, there is one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction, and I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials for deposit in the royal treasury. The king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Then the king told Haman, the money and people are given to you to do with as you see fit.
All right, so here we have a calendar of events. We're in the month of Nisan. The lot falls on the month of Adar. And you'll notice that's basically a full year. So we're going from roughly March, April to roughly February, March. And that's the timeline for which Haman is preparing. This is, did it go? Let's see if it'll go. Oh, okay. We're good. Oh, there we go. That's a Peru cube. That's one of the lots. Haman cast lots to determine the day and month that were most auspicious for the destruction of the Jews. Now, as it turns out, the God of Israel directed the lot to frustrate Haman's plot. The Persian practice of casting lots is also mentioned by Herodotus, and the example of a lot shown here comes from Mesopotamia. Its cubic shape is similar to that of a modern six-sided die. So Haman basically rolls dice and takes the result as when his move would be auspicious, and that's how he decides when he's going to attack the Jews. If you've ever felt like your government was rolling the dice on things, just be thankful that you're not Persian, because they did it for real. All right. So this is 4 or 5 years after Esther became queen. We're in the 3rd year, we've got the banquet. In the 7th year, Esther is taken into Xerxes. And in the 12th year, Haman's plot is organized, there in verse 7. What reason does Haman give to Xerxes for his request? Why does he want to destroy all the Jews instead of just Mordecai?
Because they're not obeying.
Okay, they're not obeying. He says they don't obey the king's laws. They've got their own laws. And what else? Okay, be a personal benefit to him. In fact, he offers what? He offers money. He says, I will pay you to be able to do this. And he offers them, I have 375 tons of silver. Does anybody say talents? 10,000 talents. So the annual income is about 16,000 for Persia in taxes. Haman is basically offering to double what they stand to pull in taxes as his blood price, we'll call it, for taking on the Jews. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I did some recent research. 1 talent of gold in today's prices is about $3.5 million. So I can't do that high math, but it's a lot.
That is a lot, yeah. So quick math. If it were, so we're talking about if we said 400, 1 talent you said is $3.5 million. So 10,000 talents. We're looking at what, roughly, is that 30 billion or 300 billion? Somewhere in that neighborhood. Yeah, the GDP of a major nation, basically, is what Haman is offering to destroy the Jews. All right, we'll pick up here next week. Thank you all for your attention and your comments.